January 12, 1944, a muddy trench in Italy. The sun hung low in the sky, its faint light struggling to pierce through the thick fog of war that enveloped the battlefield. The air was heavy with the stench of blood and gunpowder, as shells screamed overhead, exploding into violent bursts of earth and debris. The noise was deafening, a constant barrage of artillery that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the earth. And amid the chaos, a lone figure moved with determined precision, her silhouette cutting through the smoke-filled air. Nurse Ellen Campbell. She was crouched low, her boots caked in the mud of the front lines, her uniform stained with blood, some of it her own. The 25-year-old nurse had been on the battlefield for hours, tending to the wounded, moving between the cries of agony and the deafening gunfire. It seemed impossible that anyone could survive in this inferno, but Ellen did not hesitate. She never did. Under the constant threat of enemy fire, she would leap from one wounded soldier to the next, applying bandages, administering morphine, and offering what little comfort she could. Her hands, trembling from exhaustion, worked with a calmness that belied the chaos surrounding her. The men she cared for were not just strangers. They were brothers, comrades in arms who shared the same desperation to hold on to life. The morning had begun like any other on the Italian front, hopelessly brutal. The Allied forces had launched an assault in the early hours, pushing up a ridge toward German positions, but they had encountered fierce resistance. By noon, the battlefield had turned into a nightmare. The wounded flooded the makeshift aid station, their bodies shredded by shrapnel, torn by bullets and broken by the relentless violence of war. Ellen, like the rest of the medical staff, had been trained to endure the unimaginable. But what was unfolding before her now was nothing short of a miracle, a challenge that even the bravest among them had never faced. As the German artillery continued to rain down on their position, Ellen was told that the medical supplies were running dangerously low. The situation was critical. They were on the edge of defeat, the lines of communication with higher command severed by the bombardment. The enemy had them pinned down. The soldiers she cared for were on the brink of death, and every second mattered. Yet through the haze of chaos and confusion, there was no room for doubt. Ellen made a decision. She would not wait for evacuation. She would not sit idly by as her brothers in arms bled out. She would do the impossible. Without hesitation, Ellen ordered her team to gather what little medical equipment they had left. But it wasn't enough. There were too many soldiers, too many injured, too many broken. Still, she didn't falter. She had seen death too many times to be intimidated by it. In the midst of it all, Ellen stood tall, a pillar of unwavering courage in a storm of fear and panic. The clock was ticking. The sun's light was fading as the hours wore on, but Ellen refused to give in to exhaustion. With a team of 3 other medics, she moved from one casualty to the next, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. There was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. It was a race against death, and Ellen was determined to win. But it wasn't just the wounded soldiers that Ellen had to contend with. The enemy was relentless. German snipers had zeroed in on their position, and the sound of bullets whizzing through the air was a constant reminder of the danger they faced. Every time Ellen stepped out of the aid station, she risked her life. The landscape was treacherous, rubble, fallen trees, and shattered buildings offering little cover. Yet somehow Ellen moved through it all with the focus and determination of someone who had long since stopped fearing the threat of death. Every time she made her way across the battlefield, she encountered soldiers in unimaginable pain, some screaming in agony, others too weak to speak. Yet Ellen never turned away. Each life mattered to her. Every wounded soldier, regardless of rank, was a priority. She held their hands, whispered reassurances, and promised them that help was on the way. There was no room for doubt, no room for giving up. The war around her raged on, but in that small corner of the battlefield, Ellen Campbell was fighting a battle of her own, a battle to save every life she could. As the hours passed, the field around her became a blur of smoke, fire, and death. Yet Ellen kept moving, her every step taken with purpose. There were no medals for this kind of bravery, no recognition for what she was doing. This was not about glory. It was about survival, the survival of those she cared for, the survival of her comrades in arms, the soldiers who had come to depend on her. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellen had saved over 200 wounded soldiers. Some had been dragged to safety, others carried by the makeshift stretchers that had been assembled. But through it all, Ellen never wavered. Her courage, the kind of courage that defied logic, defied the horrors around her, had turned the tide. As the Allies eventually regained control of the battlefield and the wounded were evacuated, Ellen stood among the survivors. Her body was battered, her uniform torn, but she was alive. And in that moment, she realized that the impossible had been achieved, not just by her, but by every soldier she had saved. This was not just a story of survival. It was a story of courage that transcended the physical limitations of the human body. It was a story of a woman who faced the impossible and emerged victorious. A woman who saved 200 lives under the harshest conditions, under the constant threat of death, with nothing more than sheer determination, skill, and an unbreakable will to survive. But there was no time for rest. The battle was far from over. The wounded needed care, and Ellen was ready to do whatever it took to save them. The story of Nurse Ellen Campbell was not just a tale of heroism. It was a testament to the power of human resilience, the strength that rises in the face of unspeakable adversity, and the unshakable belief that one person can make all the difference. The battle had not yet ended, but the echoes of victory were already beginning to fade into the cold grey night. Ellen Campbell, covered in the grime and blood of war, stood among the survivors, her breath heavy and labored. But there was no time to celebrate. Her mind was focused on the task ahead, the soldiers still lying in the mud, the ones who had been left behind, the ones whose lives still hung in the balance. At that very moment, as the last of the injured were carried away, the reality of Ellen's actions began to sink in. Her courage, the kind of courage that refused to yield to fear, had made the impossible possible. She had defied the odds and saved hundreds of lives. But what no one could see, what no one could understand, was the price she had paid. By now, the medical supplies had run out completely. The field hospital, once bustling with activity, was now eerily silent, save for the sounds of Ellen's breath and the distant explosions that still rocked the battlefield. The German artillery had stopped firing for a brief moment, but it would not be long before the next barrage came. The wounded soldiers, their faces etched with pain, lay in makeshift beds, waiting for help that might never come. Despite the severity of the situation, Ellen remained unfazed. She had seen worse. She had seen men who were once full of life slip away in front of her eyes. She had witnessed the brutal, relentless toll that war took on the human body, and yet she had never once backed down from her duty. With her team of medics, Ellen continued to work tirelessly through the night, tending to the wounded, comforting them, and doing everything in her power to keep them alive. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the situation was becoming increasingly dire. The supplies were gone. The enemy was closing in. The battlefield was littered with debris and broken bodies. And Ellen had no choice but to make a decision that would forever alter the course of the battle. She ordered her team to gather what little medical equipment remained and prepare for a daring mission. The wounded, many of them barely conscious, were depending on her. She could not abandon them. With each passing minute, the threat of enemy fire grew closer, but Ellen was undeterred. She was determined to save as many lives as she could, even if it meant stepping out of the relative safety of the aid station and into the heart of the conflict. As the first light of dawn crept across the battlefield, Ellen and her team moved out. They had a plan, but it was a dangerous one. They would have to navigate through enemy lines, under heavy fire, and rescue the wounded soldiers who were scattered across the battlefield. It was a mission that would test their courage and resolve like never before. But Ellen was not afraid. She had faced death countless times, and each time she had emerged victorious. This time would be no different. The journey was treacherous. The ground was littered with rubble, the remnants of artillery strikes and the mangled bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning fuel. The sound of enemy fire filled the air as German snipers targeted anything that moved. But Ellen moved forward, her mind focused on the soldiers she had sworn to save. With each step, the danger grew more intense. The team moved quickly, crouching low, keeping their heads down, as they advanced toward the farthest reaches of the battlefield. There was no room for error. Every movement had to be calculated, every decision made with the utmost precision. Ellen led the way, her every step taken with purpose, her every glance sweeping across the field for potential threats. They reached the first group of wounded soldiers, 6 men, all in critical condition. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest as she knelt beside them, her hands working quickly and efficiently. She applied bandages, administered painkillers, and reassured them as best as she could. But there was no time to linger. The enemy was closing in. They had to move. The team quickly hoisted the soldiers onto stretchers and began their retreat. But the path back to the aid station was not an easy one. As they moved through the battlefield, the air erupted with gunfire. Bullets whizzed past their heads, striking the ground around them. One of the medics, a young man named Jack, was struck in the shoulder. He cried out in pain, but Ellen didn't hesitate. She quickly administered a shot of morphine to numb the pain and urged him to keep moving. With each step, the tension mounted. The enemy was relentless, their fire constant, their pursuit unyielding. Ellen's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder, her mind calculating the safest route. They were almost back to the aid station, but the enemy was closing in fast. The sounds of approaching footsteps echoed through the smoke-filled air. Ellen could hear the crackle of radios and the shouts of German soldiers, their voices growing louder as they neared. They reached the aid station just in time. The team rushed the wounded soldiers inside, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding with adrenaline. But as Ellen turned to help Jack, who was now struggling to stand, she heard the unmistakable sound of an incoming shell. The explosion rocked the ground, throwing her to the ground. The world spun as debris rained down around her. When the dust cleared, Ellen pushed herself up, her face smeared with dirt and blood, but her resolve stronger than ever. The mission was not over. There were still soldiers out there, still lives to be saved. And despite the growing number of casualties, despite the mounting danger, Ellen Campbell refused to stop. She had come this far and she would go further still. She would save them all or she would die trying. Her team, battered and bruised, stood by her side as the battle raged on. But Ellen's courage had become a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. With each wounded soldier she saved, her legend grew. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a symbol of hope, of the impossible made possible. And in the heart of that battlefield, where death and destruction seemed to reign supreme, one woman's courage had turned the tide of war. As the sun dipped below the horizon on January 13th, the smoke over the battlefield thickened, blending with the setting light, casting a surreal orange glow over the ruins of war. The roar of artillery, the sharp crack of rifle fire, and the distant whine of mortars became the backdrop to a scene where death danced through the air. Yet in the midst of this chaos, there stood Ellen Campbell, the woman who had been on the front lines for nearly 24 hours, whose hands were soaked in blood not her own, whose every breath carried the weight of 200 men, whose lives were saved by her will alone. Yet despite the unimaginable challenges, the battle raged on, and Ellen's courage had only grown. She had no idea that in the coming days, her name would be whispered by soldiers from both sides of the conflict, etched into the annals of history as the woman who had defied every expectation of what was possible under fire. But for Ellen, there was no time to bask in glory. The survivors she had saved still needed her. Their pain, their fear, was something she could not leave behind. Even now, amid the fires of war, the task was far from over. The aid station, though a sanctuary, was far from safe. German artillery was relentless, each shell that exploded in the distance, a reminder that their enemies were closing in, determined to crush the resistance and prevent any escape. But for Ellen and her team, this was no longer just about survival. It was about hope. It was about proving that humanity could rise above even the most unimaginable circumstances, that one person, no matter how small, no matter how injured, could still make a difference. As Ellen walked the corridors of the makeshift hospital, she saw soldiers lying in agony, their eyes wide with terror, many murmuring the names of loved ones. It was impossible to keep up with the stream of the wounded. Every man in the field needed her, but not every man could be saved. Yet she would not let them face death alone. For her, there was no such thing as impossible. There was only the next soldier, the next life, the next moment to make a difference. Despite the overwhelming odds, Ellen's actions began to take on an almost legendary quality. The sound of her name echoed through the aid station, whispered by the wounded, as they tried to grasp the reality of her efforts. She had worked through exhaustion, through the worst of the battlefield to tend to them all, and in the process, she had become something more than just a nurse. She had become a lifeline. The stories of her bravery would soon spread to higher command, where a report was drafted in her honor. A rare acknowledgement for a woman serving in such dangerous circumstances. She had saved over 200 soldiers, some of them grievously injured, others on the brink of death. But she had not let them die alone. Her team, though fatigued and battered, had risen to the occasion, inspired by her unflinching resolve. But Ellen's strength came not from brute force or power. Her strength came from her heart, her deep, unshakable belief in the power of human kindness amidst the flames of war. As the battle raged into the night, her medics worked in tandem with her, the rhythm of their efforts as synchronized as any military unit. But it was Ellen's leadership, her ability to remain calm in the face of terror, that made all the difference. She led not with words, but with action, each movement a testament to the quiet bravery that flows through the veins of those who serve others without question. But even as the medical staff worked tirelessly to stabilize the wounded, the external threat grew more imminent. German forces were closing in on their position, the rumble of tanks growing louder, the sound of boots marching steadily toward them. It was only a matter of time before the enemy would overrun their position, but Ellen would not leave, not when there was still work to be done, not when there were still men to save. She would face whatever came with the same courage that had sustained her throughout the day. With the wounded soldiers secured in the makeshift shelters, Ellen knew that they were still far from safety. The medical supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing, and it was clear that without reinforcements, they would not be able to continue their efforts much longer. But in those dark hours of uncertainty, Ellen continued to lead. She sent her team to find whatever they could: bandages, painkillers, any supplies they could scavenge from the battlefield. Every minute mattered. Every second counted. As the hours passed, the situation grew dire. The German forces had begun their final push, and Ellen knew that the aid station was no longer tenable. But even then, she didn't leave. She stayed with her men, watching as the last of the medics made their way back, carrying what little they had found. The explosions had come closer, the sounds of death echoing through the trees. Still, Ellen remained unwavering. The decision was clear. They would make one last push to evacuate the wounded, to bring them to safety. In the midst of that chaos, as shells exploded overhead and dust filled the air, Ellen and her team fought through the smoke, running toward the front lines, carrying stretchers, guiding soldiers to safety. The field hospital was abandoned, but the work was far from over. And Ellen, despite the wounds that covered her body, despite the exhaustion that had crept into her bones, pushed forward. And then, just as the enemy made its final charge, a miracle happened. Reinforcements arrived. Allied tanks rolled into the area, their guns roaring to life as they provided the cover Ellen and her team desperately needed to evacuate the wounded. As the last of the injured soldiers were loaded onto trucks, Ellen stood at the rear, watching the battlefield she had just left behind. The battle was won, but the victory was not just in the weapons that had been used, but in the hearts of those who had refused to give in. The soldiers who had fought alongside Ellen, and those she had saved, would go on to tell the story of a woman who had defied the odds, who had done what no one thought possible under fire. In the darkest moments of war, Ellen Campbell's courage had not only saved lives, it had ignited a flame that would burn long after the battlefield fell silent. Her actions on that battlefield would go down in history as a testament to the power of human courage. It was not the guns that won this war. It was the human spirit, the courage to stand firm when everything seemed impossible. Ellen Campbell's legacy would live on, not as the nurse who just did her job, but as the woman who saved 200 lives, all under fire, all with nothing but sheer courage and determination. This was not just a victory in battle. It was a victory for humanity itself.